Hello, my name is Guadalupe Velasquez, and I'm the Assistant Director of Community Relations Commission. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's here to participate in our Lunch and Learn today. I'm here on behalf of Director Napoleon Bell, our Executive Director. I'd like to begin by also saying happy birthday, Columbus. At this time, I'd like to bring up our Commissioner, Allison Poirier.
Welcome, everybody. For those who are here as well as those in the viewing audience, we appreciate your time and interest in our topic today. What we are discussing today is 200 years in us, and the purpose of this discussion, since it is the birthday of Columbus, is to talk about inclusion within our community. So what I'd like to do is begin by having our panelists introduce themselves, and if we could start and simply go left to right, if you could introduce yourselves and which organization or population you're here presenting, I would appreciate it.
My name is Carla Lortz. I currently own and operate KR Consultants out of Delaware, Ohio. I'm here representing the disability community. I was the former director of the Governor's Council on People with Disabilities for more years than I probably want to even tell you about. And I've been actively involved in the writing and passage of Ohio's civil rights law for people with disabilities, as well as involved at the national, state, and local levels with the passage and implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Thank you, Carla. Bruce?
My name is Bruce Warner. I've been asked to be here as a historian. That's sort of a wild guess, but I do love history, and I am active in the history area in Columbus. I retired from the railroad, about 37 years of service. I am very active in Franklinton, where I live, in the area commissions and the Leiden Community House and the Development Association and things of that nature. But the Columbus Historical Society and the Franklin Historical Society is something I really love and very active in.
Thank you, Bruce. Gloria?
I'm Gloria McCauley. I'm the Executive Director of Bravo, which is Buckeye Region Anti-Violence Organization. And we work specifically with the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities in central Ohio and actually throughout the state. We've been doing this for almost 20 years. And like Bruce, history is one of my loves. So I was very happy to be invited to be here.
And we're very happy to have you. Thank you. Orville?
Yes, Orville Johns. I'm administrator at the Department of Administrative Services, state of Ohio. I've been in Columbus for about 20 years, and I live in Old Town East and right near Franklin Park. I love that neighborhood. I'm a board member for Roots Gallery. Roots Gallery does a lot of work in the community, especially over at the Afrocentric High School. I was a former board member of City Year Columbus, which does volunteer work throughout the schools and teach literacy. And I'm also a former member of the Columbus Council of World Affairs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lily.
Good afternoon. My name is Lily Cavanaugh, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Latino Affairs Commission. And I am here today to share with you some information about Hispanics in Central Ohio.
Thank you. Welcome, panelists. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump right into questions now, if that's okay. And we're going to start. We'll start with Carla. If we could talk about, and please break this down to your particular population, can we talk a little bit about the history of specific populations within the community in regards to the growth of Columbus's diversity?
Well, that's a pretty big topic to try to address in 5 minutes, but I'll try. First of all, I just want to say hi to Fran Frazier that I've known from a couple of other lifetimes here, but it's good to see you, Fran. We have to, I think about where people with disabilities have been in the last 200 years of our civilization in America, not just Columbus, but originally people with disabilities were warehoused in institutions such as we find still the remnants of Columbus Developmental Center and the Columbus State Hospital and some other institutions like that. And it really was not until 1968 that people with disabilities began to have an awakening about civil rights in this country. A young man from Georgia who was an attorney and used a wheelchair got tired of climbing up the steps of courthouses and getting his clothes all dirty and then having to go into court. And he convinced Congress to enact legislation in 1968 that was called the Architectural Barriers Act, which turned out to be the very first civil rights legislation for people with disabilities in this country. What it really said was that any buildings that were built with federal financial assistance had to be accessible. And it just whizzed right through Congress. Nobody ever blinked an eye and never even realized that this was really, truly a historic document that was the beginning of civil rights for people with disabilities in this country. We moved on then to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, and in that perspective we had additional civil rights sort of hidden in the Rehabilitation Act, which provided that people who wanted to be employed in agencies now. We've moved from architecture to individual entities that receive federal financial assistance, that employers could not discriminate against them. And in addition, there were some other pieces of legislation in there that talked about the need for architectural access and educational access. Again, it passed through Congress with almost no debate, and no one, I don't think, in Congress really understood that it too was some pretty dramatic civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. And we moved on through time and space, and we began to see people being employed. We saw people, and that included people in Columbus. We began to see the advent of curb ramps and accessible transportation and other things of that nature. And then finally in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted. That was a little more controversial because that impacted a whole lot more people than any of the other laws had done. And so as of today, you know, from the perspective of those of you sitting in the audience, you probably see all the curb cuts and ramps and things of that nature and think that everything's just fine and dandy and, you know, we're all out there just happy as little clams. Unfortunately, that isn't just exactly the case. We still are fighting battles over architectural access. People with disabilities are still one of the biggest minorities when it comes to unemployment. And we've just kind of traded one form of segregation for another. When we had the big institutions, we had lots of people with disabilities in one place. Now we segregate them out into group homes or small isolated classrooms within a school system and say that they've been mainstream. I don't know how many of you have heard the news the last couple of days, but the Ohio Legal Rights Services has filed a suit against the city of Columbus because some teacher in his or her infinite wisdom put a child in a restraint closet, actually, and you think, how can this happen? This is 2012. But those kinds of things, and I'm not picking on Columbus because I know from my experience with the Governor's Council, those kinds of things were happening when I was still employed, and I'm sure they're still happening now. So, you know, we've kind of exchanged one form of segregation for a different kind. I had a friend once who said that discrimination is like a chameleon. It changes colors and denies that it ever existed. And in many respects, that's what's happened to, and is still happening with people with disabilities. There are things that have happened, and I can, you know, from my perspective, when I go to downtown Columbus, it's infinitely different than it was when I was out there 40 years ago. And we can look at places like the Lincoln Theater, which is just a gorgeous example of architectural accessibility, and know that things are happening and they are better, but we still got a long way to go.
Thank you so much. Bruce?
Well, that's a hard act to follow. But you know, Columbus is, and I traveled for 2.5 years on the railroad, and I traveled everything from St. Louis to New York and Boston, Detroit, West Virginia, and I was in a lot of cities. And I used to complain about Columbus till I moved around, and I found that Columbus was a pretty neat place. And I think diversity in Columbus is potentially just leaps and bounds ahead of what it was when I was a young child. And in history, if you look at history, when Lucas Sullivan founded Columbus in 1797, in 1803 they had a child, a young man, and there was another man who was with Mr. Lucas Sullivan, who became involved with an African American woman, and they had a child, and they deserted that child. And no one, it's lost in history why they deserted the child. But his wife, Sarah Sullivan, raised that child as her own, and Lucas accepted that child. That child was Arthur Boak, and he was a brother to his brothers, and they saw that he lived that way. And this was early on. This is 1803. So it started in Columbus in 18, and it's amazing because Lucas Sullivan and his wife both were Virginians who come from slave states, and this was what they were raised with, but yet they took this young African American and raised him as their own. You'll see a statue down on Broad Street at Veterans Memorial, right next to Veterans Memorial, of Sarah Sullivan holding a child in the air. And it's a celebration of life is the name of the statue, and that is for Sarah Sullivan and Arthur Boak. So it's been a long, hard road for Columbus over the years, but it's getting better all the time. I know that I went to a diversity school. I went to Columbus South, where I graduated from, and many classmates I had were of all races and religions. And I can remember one time as a youth, and this is maybe something I shouldn't tell, but we were in the band, and we had went to a different town. I won't say the name of the town, and we all went in a restaurant, and they refused to serve some of the members of the band because they were black. And the kids come out and told us about it, some of their shit. And we all went in as a mass. There must have been 25 of us, I guess, at the time. And went in the restaurant, all sat down, and we all ordered something. And we all sat there and waited. We didn't even take a drink of water or nothing. And when it was all served, we got up and left everything set. I don't think they were too happy about that, but I think we made our point very well. So this is something that I think it's bred in people in Columbus. it's something that I've seen, and I really think it's going to go forward. And I'm glad I live here in Columbus.
Thank you. We're glad you live here too.
Yeah.
Gloria?
Well, gosh, it's really difficult with the, I'm going to use the acronym LGBT, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, because that's just really hard to keep putting into sentences. There was no LGBT community anywhere in the U.S. 200 years ago. In fact, the word homosexuality and the word heterosexuality was invented around 1900, the turn of the previous century, by the very new field of psychiatry and psychology, when they decided that they had to categorize people. Prior to that, people were people with behaviors. Oh yes, Mr. So-and-so, well, we know that even though he's married and has 5 children, we know that he sees other men. We don't talk about it. We don't have a name for it. He was not defined by that. He was just Mr. So-and-so. At that point, we had these little cubby holes where we categorized people by sexual orientation. And up until less than 50 years ago, it was very dangerous to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, not just here in Columbus, but nationally. But I'll give you a few examples. And these are laws that were in Columbus, as well as many other cities around the country. Up until 1973, it was illegal to leave your house unless you were wearing 3 obvious pieces of clothing that matched your gender identification. Which is hard for us to reconcile today because, you know, what's women's clothing? What's men's clothing? I mean, how many of us just wear the Levi's? It was illegal to, and I'm using the legal term that was in effect then, appear as a member of the other sex. So we had, and I'm talking in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and early 70s, a whole group of people who either as their hobby or as their living were female illusionists. You might know them as drag queens. And they knew that when they stepped off the stage, the police were standing outside the door and they were going right to jail because they had violated the law. Another law in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, you could not find a gay club if you were looking for one. You had to know somebody who knew where it was because they never had signs outside. And so if you found out where one was and you went there, it was a solid door with a peek hole, and a big burly bouncer would look through the peek hole and decide whether to let you in. You go in and it's like any other dingy club. Pool table, dance floor, and disco ball, except the disco ball was not lit up. So you spend your evening, you have a cocktail, you're playing pool, you're dancing, and all of a sudden, the disco ball lights up. That is your signal to find a dance partner of the other sex. because the police were coming in. Because at that time in Columbus and many other places, it was illegal to dance in public with a member of the same sex. So for many, many years, it was illegal to be us. Other states had even more constrictive laws, so we did pretty good. In New York City, there was a law on the books until the mid-'70s that said homosexuals could not congregate on a public street in a crowd more than 3. Virginia had a law up until 8 years ago that said it was illegal to serve alcohol to a homosexual. So, things were bad. Things aren't great. But we no longer take our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth and put them in mental hospitals and give them shock therapy to cure them. That was the standard treatment until 1973. I see hope. We have made incredible progress. We have lots of states that are initiating the right to marry. It's a little difficult in Ohio since we've banned that. But I still see so much need. And I will leave you with an example of the need. Just yesterday evening, I got a call about a young woman, 14-year-old middle school student, who went home from school on Tuesday, and her mother had found a letter between her and a girlfriend and found out that her 14-year-old is a lesbian. Her mother beat her up. She didn't go to school. She was supposed to go to an after-school thing. She didn't go because she'd just been beat up. She went to school yesterday, and that's when we were contacted because she was terrified to go home. She is 14 years old, and her mother is so distraught because her daughter's a lesbian that she is able to forget 14 years of love and caring and use physical violence against her because of who she is. We have a long way to go. I'll leave it at that for now.
Wow. Okay. Orville, the African American community, please.
Thanks for that. That's eloquent in your history and analysis. And Bruce, thank you for the information about the Sullivan and their child, the first child. It was interesting. I want to give a viewpoint. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Lived in many cities, Providence, Rhode Island, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Charlotte, North Carolina. I actually lived in Fremont, Ohio. Many of you may know where Fremont, Ohio is. It was interesting. Came to Columbus about 20 years ago, and also was a history buff as well. One of the things I understood about Columbus was obviously during the 1800s and during the war and afterwards. It was actually a good safe haven for many African Americans traveling north. If you think about Chillicothe, Marion, even Athens, Ohio, there's populations of freed slaves and what we would call mulattoes who settled in those areas feeling safe, feeling that they've made it across the Mason-Dixon line. Many of them continue to travel up to Detroit, Toledo, to make their living into Canada. So clearly with Columbus being at the center, obviously it wasn't the capital at the time, but the center of Ohio, it was well traveled by African Americans. And many of us made it our home, or many of us, again, found safe passage. Obviously, during the civil rights movement, like any other major city, we had our challenges. We had many times when our safety was in jeopardy, but we took it upon ourselves to continue to fight. We have the Urban League as well as many other cities that took a major role in making sure we had rights. But as we moved forward, I found Columbus to be a place where African Americans can settle into any community, primarily any community. I mean, it wasn't as segregated as when I grew up in Pittsburgh. I mean, if you know Pittsburgh, it was the second most segregated city in the country for many years running, and the worst for African American males in the country. I didn't find that here when I got to Columbus. I found that the population when I got here was about 90, 92. Many African Americans were established, organized, feeling free, feeling like they had a voice. And if you remember Jerry Hammond, whose building, his namesake we're in, I met him early on, and I was just amazed that he was president of council. I was amazed. I don't know how else to put it, because we had aldermen in Pittsburgh, but even though being in the area called the Hill District, if some of you may know, it's more like a Harlem environment, we didn't have our own representation. And to get here and to not only know we had it, but it was accessible. Sam Gresham, who was the CEO and president of the Urban League, was available to me. Larry James was available to me. Akko Kambone, Kahari, and Oharo. I walked into that environment, and I was just welcomed and decided to stay. One of the things I also understood was that because it became the hub of government, there was many opportunities for African Americans, families, not just African Americans, but families to find employment and to grow. The neighborhoods were very strong at the time. You had South Side, obviously, but you had the Bottoms, the Hilltop, and Near East Side, Far East Side, now obviously moving more north. But I believe if you go to any neighborhood, any small city near Columbus, and you will find African Americans represented. Even with government, we had Ben Espy run for mayor, first time African American, ran for mayor. Now we have a current mayor who's African American and for a historic fourth term. It's amazing. Now we have Joyce Beatty probably going to represent Columbus and D.C. as a councilwoman. And we have current Franklin County auditors, a Republican African American, Clarence Mingo. I don't think in many other cities that we can have that much representation. Job opportunities are generally better for African Americans than where government is abound. Obviously we have the city, county, and state. But don't mistake that because the government is there that we have higher employment opportunities than the majority population. 16% of the state workers are African Americans, but primarily they're women. So we still have those challenges that we have to give families, male and female, family head households, the opportunity to be role models for their children. And that's not always happening if we can't find employment. So that's there, and I'm excited about that. But the job opportunities are available, and if you think about other cities, African Americans generally are employed at a higher rate in Columbus than many other major cities that it's not predominantly African Americans, such as obviously Detroit and Atlanta. But we're growing, and as Columbus grows, the opportunities for African Americans are growing. We have a lot of business opportunities here. Honda does well with African Americans, Patel. Ohio State universities have leadership that African American, Gene Smith, athletic director, Dr. Valerie Lee, who's vice provost of diversity and inclusion, and just was named to refill Joyce Beatty's old role as outreach and engagement senior vice president. She's a great person. I met her when I first got here, when she was starting the Women's Studies program, went on and headed up the English department, and just watching her grow, I never thought that there was a barrier for our success if we worked hard at it. It was up to us, and I think it's always up to us with our future. So again, as Columbus grows, it's been 200 years, obviously our position has grown as well, but our future relies in our own hands.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lily?
Yes, to think of Latinos in Ohio, we tend to try to go back to just the last maybe 20, 25 years. But truly, Hispanics have been in our state since the late 1800s, early 1900s. Some of the research that has been conducted tells us that students who came to the Ohio State University are among the first ones that we have actual documentation on. In fact, in the year 1903, Ohio State University graduated 2 men from Argentina who came here to get degrees in veterinary medicine. In 1917, we have the first Latina who receives a degree from the Ohio State University as a Bachelor of Arts, and she came from Panama. And then in 1930, the university graduates the first Hispanic attorney, Rafael Gonzalez. So if we see that first part of the century, we know that already there is a representation of Hispanics in Central Ohio. The larger representation starts coming in the 1960s. And that is a time in our history when we see a surge of Hispanic immigration to the U.S. But instead of them coming from Spain, now we see them coming from Central and South American countries. And some of you may recall the resettlement of the Cuban families here in Columbus, when suddenly there was the bridge that was done so that a lot of those families that were fleeing Cuba were able to resettle in our city. They were coming here, why? Because they were hoping for economic opportunities, for places where they could raise their children, and that is why the population soared. In the late 1960s, we see the formation of Latino groups that start a group called the Cuban Circle, as well as the Latin Quarters. And these were groups that families were creating to provide support to each other and to help each other learn how to navigate within the city. As we move on into the later part of the 1900s, we see that farmers are beginning to raise crops, that they need more manual labor. We see all kinds of different economic opportunities that make it attractive for Hispanics to come here. But we have to remember that Hispanics have already been well established in the north part of our state. If you know about the area of Toledo and the northwest part of Ohio, we have a very regular flow of migrant workers that would come to pick the crops. And also we had the steel factories and the mill industries in the area of Cleveland, Lorain, and Youngstown that attracted a very large Puerto Rican community. So although the greater number of Hispanics were located in the northern part of the state, as the city of Columbus continued to grow, it presented new opportunities for Latinos to come here, not only from the traditional settlements in the north of the state, but also from other countries. We also have to remember that the Ohio State University is a huge magnet for Latinos from many countries who come there to pursue an education, who are giving opportunities for internships after they complete their education, and who many times choose to make Columbus their home. And along the way, they will bring families and more relatives that will settle here as well. So the population in Columbus is a bit different than what you would expect in places like Lorain and Toledo, as I mentioned, but still we do have a very large Mexican community that has been part of Hispanics in Central Ohio. Between 2000 and 2006, 82% of the new residents in the state of Ohio were foreign-born. So that's something that we need to consider. 82% of the new residents in our state were foreign-born. And of them, 22% were coming from Latin America. The largest number of these new Americans was comprised by the Asians, who were the 40%. And were coming here, many of them employed by the universities and hospitals, as well as about 23% of people from Africa and 13% of people from Europe. So already the look of our city is changing quite a bit between the year 2000 and 2006, when we see this huge influx of Latinos, Asians, and Africans, contrasting with the traditional migration patterns where we would expect more of the European people to come here. In fact, by the year 2006, the census revealed that about 264,000 Ohioans were of Hispanic heritage. That was 2.3% of the Ohio population. Now, between 2006 and 2009, there was another big explosion of Latinos coming into our state. Again, job opportunities is a main factor why they would come here. And those numbers have exploded not only because of the Latino community, but also Columbus experienced a huge influx of the African communities, the Somali communities. So what we have seen is that not only Central Ohio has attracted a lot of Latinos, but also the people that are coming here are young, with an average age of 24 or 25. Many of them are starting families. So we see now a large influx of young children and young people that are settling here. The latest figures from the 2010 census tell us that the population of Hispanics in Central Ohio has doubled. Conservative estimates say it's about 45,000. It's probably a lot more than that. But I think that it's important for us to recall that from those early days, the community has always been well organized. They have always wanted to make Central Ohio their home. They have always been trying to seek for the progress, not just of their own families, but of the communities where they live. And through the history of our community here in Central Ohio, we can see from the early 1960s to the early 70s and 80s, the effort that these leaders made not only to contribute to their communities, but to start publishing newspapers, having television programs, having cultural centers, having all these kinds of support systems that not only treasure the cultural heritage of the Latino community, but also tries to improve the well-being of those that are around them. And many have been the successes that we could point out here of key milestones in our community. But one thing that we are extremely proud of is the participation of Latinos in industry, in leadership, in the private and the public sector. We're very proud of Ramona Reyes, who now serves on the Board of Education. She's a young Latina that pretty much exemplifies that desire of Hispanics to be people that contribute to make our communities a better place and that are committed to be here for the long term.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You all have provided some very interesting and compelling background information. If we could, I'd like to talk a little bit about the community's perception of the individual populations over the past years, good, bad, or indifferent, and what might have been some of the key components to the shift in that perception, and if anybody was an influential player in that perceptional switch, if we could talk about that. I know that's a lot, but in light of time, I want to get everything in because this is very interesting.
Well, when we talk about perceptions of people with disabilities, I think it's important to remind all of us that people with disabilities are the only minority in this country that anybody can join at any time. And we need to always keep that in mind when we're interacting with people with disabilities, because at some point it could be you. Not necessarily that you're ever going to use a wheelchair, but because of age or illness or some other factor, we all can join this minority at any point in our lives. Some of the other panelists were talking about statistics, and for the disability population, and it sort of depends on who you talk to and whose study you look at, but it's estimated that 1 out of every 8 or 1 out of every 10 people in the country have some type of disability. So we always need to keep that kind of in mind, because the common misconception, it seems, on the part of politicians and policymakers is that it's a very small group of people, and therefore, you know, that's the first place you can cut funding, cut programs. You can be excused from making your buildings accessible, because really there aren't very many people out there who need those kinds of things. In terms of the perceptions that I've encountered over the years, I have to give an example, because I think it really is a classic of what has happened in Columbus and across the country over the last 40 years or so that I've been involved in doing work with people with disabilities. As a young college student, and as we all know, college students are always poor, so I managed to get a job between my sophomore and junior year in college at Recreation Unlimited. Now, Recreation Unlimited that you think of today was in no way what I worked for in the mid-'60s. There was a man named Dick Ruff who started Recreation Unlimited originally. He was a person with a disability, and at that point in time, it was almost unheard of for someone with a disability to be managing or owning or running a program that would impact on other people with disabilities. During that first summer that I worked for them, I met 2 young men. Their names were Kurt and Tim. And at the end of the summer, they asked me to come visit them. And being the young, naive person that I was, I agreed. Thought nothing of it. It was only when I realized where I was going to have to go that I began to have second thoughts. But I'd promised, so I went. They were living on a locked ward at Columbus Developmental Center. Now, I don't know how many of you, probably Fran knows about this, how many of the rest of you know about going to a locked ward at CDC, but I can tell you as a young person, it was frightening. And these 2 young men were certainly no risk to anyone. One was very severely disabled as a result of cerebral palsy and used a wheelchair. The other young man also had cerebral palsy, but it wasn't quite as limited as the one. But I was just astounded by the conditions and what these 2 young fellows were living in. Now, our perceptions have definitely changed, sometimes kicking and screaming, but we've changed. Kurt and Tim now, and have for many years, lived in their own home. They're totally independent with the help of personal assistants. And there are hundreds of those kinds of stories throughout the state of Ohio, and even in Columbus, of people who were incarcerated, if you want to call it that, in facilities when they were perfectly capable of managing their own affairs and living independently. The other reason I think perceptions have changed is because just the fact that I'm here today representing people with disabilities is an acknowledgement that people with disabilities are an important part of the community, and that we have resources and talents to provide that the community needs, and that we have the ability to participate and to be included in community life. There have been a number of organizations throughout the country that have tried to instill this idea in the minds of politicians and policymakers and community leaders over the years. But one of the organizations was called ADAPT. And one of ADAPT's sayings was, nothing about me without me, which I think is a good indicator that for many years people with disabilities were looked upon as someone who needed to be cared for, or that needed medical attention, or were sick, or any other number of describers that you want to use. So I think in many ways organizations like ADAPT, whether some of you may know of them, and some of their actions are pretty radical, but groups like ADAPT across the country, the independent living movement, the Olmstead decision, which have all impacted on the ability of people with disabilities to be, as Kurt DeYoung always said, the right to be abroad in the land. It was his favorite saying. And he was certainly one of the people who was very instrumental in the beginnings of getting people out into the community. Here in Columbus, we've had any number of people who were instrumental, people like Jack Phillips, John Leibold, Gary Kaffenberger, Ann Paquin. All of these people were post-polio people. That tells you how old I am, right? That I remember polio. And my friends had polio. But nevertheless, they were all people who refused to allow their disability to define who they were. And they were very instrumental in the very beginning stages of ensuring that buildings were going to be built accessible, that they wanted jobs. They went out and found jobs. I mean, the world has changed dramatically since 1960, I can assure you. When I graduated from college in 1964, I sent out over 500 resumes, and I did not get one response. And it was only through what I consider wisdom of a man named George Evans that I got a job out of college and went on to go to graduate school and have my career. And again, I'm sure there's lots and lots of people of my age or even younger who can tell you those kinds of stories about Columbus. I agree with the gentleman down here that I think the opportunities for people with disabilities, particularly as it relates to employment, are greater now than they've ever been. The advent of various kinds of technologies has enabled people who ordinarily would have been left home and watching TV can now be employed because of the technology that allows them to be out and about. So Columbus has changed, but I also agree with the gentleman down here that we still have a ways to go. We especially have a ways to go when I came here today, I was reminded that we still have things to do, because when I came, I still had to come in and use the freight elevator to get into the building. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, that wasn't a big deal, and you always knew you were going to have to come in through the freight elevator and go through the kitchen. I mean, that's how you got into places then. But this is 2012, and we need to encourage the development of better access. And the more access we have, the more likely it is that people with disabilities will continue to be abroad in the land, as Mr. DeYoung always said.
Thank you, Carla. Bruce, what is the perception of inclusion in Columbus? Has it changed?
Well, Columbus, when Lucas Sullivan laid out Columbus, he laid out in the Virginia military tract, which was lands that were payment for services rendered in the Revolutionary War to Virginians. Across the river, on the eastern side of the river, that was the refugee lands. And those lands were promised properties to people who the British kicked out of Canada because they didn't want the people who were sympathized for the United States there. So that was the refugee lands. Now, that's not to say that all those people came. Many of those lands were sold because I don't want to go out this wilderness, so they sold the land to different people. But that's where it started. The east bank of the river was called Wolf's Ridge, and there was one cabin over there. Well, two cabins, but only one person living there at the time Columbus was formed in 1812. So, Columbus, as it grew, 1840 was a little sleepy village, about 6,000 people. Had just not shortly before had really grown. Franklin had really grew in the War of 1812 because it was a supply depot. It was where the armies was formed to fight the British in the War of 1812 in Franklinton, and they went off from there. There were no battles here, but this is where all the bartering done, where the supplies were at, and so it grew. But it just pretty much died in 1840. It was about 6,000 people. In Columbus, Franklinton still wasn't part of Columbus then. It was a suburb, it was another place, so to speak. But in that first year, that next 10 years, Columbus doubled in size because of the road, the National Trail, and because of the canal. Next 10 years, it doubled again in size because of the railroads. And the railroads brought people in from all over Europe, mostly Europe, but also a lot from African Americans and some Asians, because they worked on the railroads. And it was a labor intensive, but it's brought people. And I think that's how Columbus has had all this influx and this intermingling of populations that's made it a great city that it is. I can't describe to you how as I go around the city and I know people and we're sitting there talking, I think, well, gee, that person is Latino, or gee, that person, and I don't think of that. I think that's Joe or Mary. That's who I think of. And I think that's a lot of the folks in Columbus is that way, and I think more every day. I think that as a history thing, it's really difficult, but history of huge populations of Irish and of Italian people. There's Italians and the Irish, and they didn't get along, but now it's all been by the wayside. And the black population has really brought Columbus on the map. And now I really don't want to see, and I think that we ourselves sometimes segregate ourselves. I want to see people, neighborhoods. I want to see neighborhoods. I want to see people in the street. I want to see people knowing each other. I want to see people all working towards the same thing, a better Columbus, a better neighborhood. And I think that's what we all need to work for, and I hope that happens. I see it happening. But I want it to happen today.
So do we. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Miss Gloria?
I just want to respond to that. I am a huge neighborhood person. I think when we create neighborhoods, that we create a community. And thank you for that. We have lived in the same neighborhood, in the same house for 28 years, and we love our neighborhood so much that we bought the house next door because it was vacant, and we didn't want things to slide. So we just hawked everything we had to buy that house, and it has worked out. But I am a big believer in neighborhoods. Oh, where was I? Perception. You know, that's a really difficult one, particularly in 2012 because of the impact of media, and particularly with the LGBT communities. Because what we see in the media are really mostly the glorified stereotypes. Now, sometimes it's positive because 50 years ago we weren't seeing anything. Or we were seeing what I call, and if you're not familiar with this groundbreaking book, you can look it up. I called it the well of loneliness syndrome. If being LGBT was noteworthy or newsworthy, it also went along with the well of loneliness syndrome, where nothing good could come of this and somebody's going to die at the end. They all get hit by a truck. Perception has changed, and I welcome that. Part of it here in Columbus is the growth of our city's attitudes on who makes up our population and our welcoming of all the diversity. I adore how Columbus has gone about this. I also have to say, in Columbus, I took over 200 reports of hate crimes last year. So, you know, there's a mixed bag. I think that perception really needs to continue changing. We no longer think of a gay man as, and I'm going to use what used to be an offensive term, a Nancy boy, who is only relegated to being a hairdresser or a flight attendant, or remember the term male nurse. Our perceptions of who is this community have changed radically in the 20 or 30 years past. They will continue to change. I think the LGBT community has had a large part in changing that perception. We have become economically a pretty good force to be reckoned with. In 4 different national organizations and magazines, Columbus is in the top 10 and sometimes in the top 5 of fabulous places to live if you are in the LGBT community, because we have civil law protections, we have job protection, we have housing protection. We have all of this. We have, you know, the possibility of domestic partner if you're a city employee. We have civil rights here that were unheard of 20 years ago. And I do a lot of work with national organizations, so I have friends all over the country. They know about Columbus because they have heard what this city has been doing for our communities. And I'm thrilled about it. We have a long way to go, but it's not like we have stopped anywhere. We are still pushing, still pushing, still pushing. No longer do we have to, okay, I'm thinking back to 1982, my very first gay pride. And bless her heart, my partner got an antique fire truck to drive in that thing. I had to have a balloon in front of my face so that I wouldn't be on camera, because I could have lost custody of my child. So everybody on the fire truck would warn me if they saw a camera, and I would pull a balloon in front of my face. That's kind of an odd way to celebrate Pride. We don't have to do that anymore because of what Columbus has done for us. So I'll leave it with that.
Great, thank you. That's very uplifting. Orville?
All right, perception. One of the perceptions is that I speak for African Americans, and obviously I don't, but that perception is still there. So we do have to deal with that. But what I want to focus on is the perception in the African American community and what we need to do to move ourselves forward. So I need to digress and give respect back to the women that I spoke often of, the men that helped me when I got to Columbus, but I also want to speak of the women. Les Wright, who's also was a former councilwoman. Dr. Jean Harris, who's current superintendent of Columbus Public Schools. Janet Jackson, who was city attorney and now is the CEO of United Way. And Jeanette Bradley, who was lieutenant governor and former state treasurer. Yvette McGee Brown also ran for lieutenant governor, but current federal judge. And Donna James, who was a segment president of the Nationwide. And Charlita Tavares, who also ran for Secretary of State and is current state senator. And also, Fran, I wanted to say Fran, but when I came to Columbus, Fran Fraser was one who also took me in and taught me about the community, and that was, obviously she is a director at the city of Columbus. So those women, to me, is equally as important to what's going on in Columbus, and the perception is that I want you to know that it's in the African American community, we look at each other as equals. We don't think, generally, I wasn't raised where men were better than women. I was raised that you value both sex and gender's opinion, and when it comes to wise and being wise and to leading in the community. So, but also now I want to talk about how politics is the perception that they're going to save us through politics. And many of you may be aware of, until the early 60s, it's going to be interesting how I say this, but the Democrats were the Republicans. Republicans were the party that freed the slaves, supposedly, and the Democrats were the ones going against it. Obviously, it shifted in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement and more people supporting President Kennedy at that time. So we have to be careful that politics is our savior, that there is that perception. And we believe that you should side with one political party or the other. We need to be careful with that as well, because no one party is going to be our savior. There's no one person that's going to be our savior. So the perception is that we still believe there's someone to come. We understand biblically that is spoken of, but in Columbus, it's not going to be one person. Obviously, the person that will come to assist us is our mothers, our fathers, our teachers, the people on the corners who we walk by in the stores and see, the business leaders. I hope the perception is that that's who are going to lead us out, and that we are always responsible for that leadership. The other thing I want to understand, I want you to understand, is the perception is that we don't work together, and that party generally prevents us from partnering, and that we African Americans are generally liberal or left leaning, and that we have nothing to conserve, so there couldn't be an African American who's conservative. There are many fiscal conservative African Americans, and there are many socially conscious African Americans, and you can be both at the same time. So we have to be careful that a party will save us, and that a political faction of a party is what's going to move us out. And it's interesting when I can recall, again, dealing with politics and business, but politics, I can recall when Kim Blackwell was running for governor, and at the time, Mayor Coleman was running for governor. I was the corporate banker or government banker for J.P. Morgan Chase, and I was asked to provide an opportunity for everyone to meet. And they walked in and they were just as friendly as, it was a shock to the people in that room. And at the time, the CEO, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, was coming in. That's who the dinner was for. And they were surprised that they had no animosity. They were both leading the state of Ohio. They weren't just leading African Americans, and they weren't just leading one party or the other. So I was really impressed with that. I also was impressed when I met Stan Harris, who was one of the first African Americans who was a government banker for National City. Yes, National City, and his wife obviously is Jean Harris, and was appointed obviously through the Democratic side. Larry James was a prominent Republican. Donna James was a prominent Democrat. You had Jeanette Bradley and Yvette McGee Brown, different parties siding with each other on certain topics in the community. So that's why the perception is that one party will save us. The perception is that we can't get along. The perception is that someone else will be the savior for us all. And I believe, as we move forward, that we need to change the perception that we have to help each other. It's our mothers, our fathers, our teachers, our pastors who's going to help us move our children forward to a brighter day.
Wow. Thank you, Orville. Very well put. Lily?
I think when we talk about perception of Latinos here in the metropolitan area in Columbus and throughout the state in general, we need to think of it from an economic perspective, because that economic perspective really puts the shade on how people are perceived. So as we look up the Latino community here, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, the issue of jobs has been a major determinant of how people perceive not only Hispanics, but many of the new American communities. Why is that? Because there's a lot of competition for limited resources. And normally, you know, people that are more humble and that consider these foreigners an economic threat. When you see all these Mexicans moving into town, they're going to steal my job. You know, all these Somalis that are here, they don't work for anything. They just get everything from the government. So there's a lot of misperceptions as to what economics role play into all this equation. Another perception is the browning of our cities. And you would hear that in certain communities. What happened to Columbus? We used to be white. Where are all these people coming from? And why do they come here? Why don't they just go somewhere else? They come from countries with mild weather and temperate weather. What are they doing here? It snows. So, you know, people try to make sense of those things because there are a lot of social and economic factors that get affected by that. So who are the victims or those that are most impacted? The people with the low social economic status. Why? Because they're more susceptible to those economic threats. So therefore, you know, a lot of people within the working class have a more negative opinion about all these new foreigners that are coming here. Then you realize that, on the other hand, the people that are coming here come here with the hope of making this their home, their future. They are having to leave behind families and their whole social structure. When they come here, they are going to adopt you as their family, as their next of kin. People of Africa, Asia, Latin America, we're very similar in that regard. And family is the foundation of who we are. It's just the sole way how we identify ourselves, and it's so critical for us. So on one hand, as some people are seeing us as a potential economic threat, we're coming here wanting to become part of that community, to be adopted into that community. And so there is a transition process that takes place so that the local people understand that we're not here to impose our ways. We are here to learn from yours and trying to find some common ground where we can simply become family. Now, as you move along, the perception between the more well-off or the educated community is quite different, even among the young community. When they see all these new Americans, when they see the Latinos, what do they see? They see people that are here that can revitalize the economy. And if some of you think of some of the different sections around town, some parts of the west side, even around Morse Road, think of what they were looking like a few years back. And how many of you can picture the tiendas, the Mexican restaurants, the little shops, all these, and it's not only Latinos, but many of these other countries and people that are coming here are bringing revitalization to our communities. What we may see as a section of town that is old and ugly and neglected, they see hope. They see the place where they can raise their families and have their children. They see the place that with a little bit of effort and work, they can turn it around and turn it into beautiful neighborhoods and nice homes. So it's a whole different perspective. What is good? What is positive? Among the younger generation, these kids are global. They don't see the Latinos or the Asians or the Africans. They just see kids. And so among the younger generation, that ethnic difference is not as marked. The economic sector of our community sees us as people with potential. Why? Because we invest, we buy, we want to make this place our own. Our city mayor plays a big role on that perception, and his commitment to always welcome everyone into the city of Columbus. And he has been one of our most sincere advocates in behalf of the Latino community, the services that they're able to have access to, and trying to help the rest of the community understand that Columbus is a place for all. And having that coming from our main leader really gives a different color to the perception of who Latinos are. Just to tell you a couple things more on this, because it's important. One of the perceptions is that we're all Mexicans. No, we're not. In the state of Ohio, 50% of the Latinos are of Mexican ancestry. That's only half. We come here, we don't go to school, and we're not committed to education. That is not true. Over 49,000 Hispanic children are enrolled in public schools. We don't make any money. That's another false statement. The median income for Hispanic families is $35,500. They do make money, and they like to spend it. And then we don't offer anything new or good for the economy. That's also a false statement. In fact, in the state of Ohio, there are over 9,700 Hispanic-owned businesses, and the receipts that those businesses present is over $2.3 billion. So do we really want to get rid of Latinos?
No. Thank you. Thank you so much. In light of time, I'm going to see if maybe each individual can speak maybe 2 to 3 minutes. I think my final question is regarding more of an educational component. In regards to inclusion, what can somebody like myself, those in the immediate audience, or those in the viewing audience do to help create neighborhoods, create communities, allow us to be part of a community and adopted into the community? Are there any, for lack of a better word, bullet points or ideas that you could give us so that we can help in the upcoming years assure that inclusion continues to happen in Columbus?
Well, I could probably give you a list that would keep you all busy for, the next 5 years maybe. But just in brief, I think what we really need as far as people with disabilities is to have all of you be advocates. We need people who will look at new buildings and say, where are the curb cuts? Where are the handicap parking spaces? Why isn't the entryway accessible? Because people with disabilities can't do it all alone. And so we need those kinds of advocates out there also looking with eyes as to what needs to be done accessibility-wise. You know, I would certainly be the first to say that not everybody who has a disability uses a wheelchair. That's, you know, that's just the way it is. But if we can get people with disabilities into the same room with everybody else, whether it's by virtue of curb cuts and handicap parking spaces, or whether it's through programmatic access of providing interpreters at meetings for people who are deaf, or materials in another format for people who are blind, or whatever it takes, that will in and of itself further the ability of people with disabilities to be in the community and to be a part of whatever community it is that they want to be a part of. Just to remind you again, you know, people with disabilities are the only minority that any of us can join at any time. So we need to always be preparing for our own futures, you know, whether it's through building a ramp into your house to allow somebody in a wheelchair to get in and visit you, whether it's advocating that the new community center be accessible for people with disabilities. Everybody can play a part in this. You don't have to be an expert when it comes to people with disabilities. You don't have to be a person with a disability. Some of the best advocates I know across the country are not people with disabilities, but they've made it their life's work to advocate and try to ensure that people with disabilities are a part of the community.
Thank you so much. Bruce?
Well, you know, I think that sometimes we've made ourselves our own worst enemies in Columbus. We've managed to chop up Columbus with freeways and isolate neighborhoods and cut through them, and that's really hurt our neighborhoods. And our neighborhoods is what is the glue that holds the city together. I think that we're now busing kids over, so now we don't have local schools. Maybe the kid lives next door to you, he goes one school and you go someplace else. And I think that's a terrible thing to do. I think that that causes disconnecting. You don't have that camaraderie, that you don't have, gee, we're going to win this football game, or we're going to win this basketball game, or we're going to do this. And I think that's something that the city has, and all of us have done to ourselves. I think we need to come back to that. We need our local neighborhoods. We need our local stores, our local thing, and then we can meld together, and that's what I think is going to make things much better than what we have today. We're working some towards that. I know that now the freeways are building the wide streets to try to connect neighborhoods together. We're finally getting some bridges across the side where things like this, it's going to help, but it's something we have to work at all the time. And I think that to get our neighborhoods back together is going to make a whole lot of world of difference for our city.
Great, thank you. Ms. Gloria?
Well, we have an apparently very disparate group of folks up here, and yet there are so many more commonalities than differences, particularly in the way communities, mainstream communities, view us. So when I am asked how can people affect change, I put it back to communities and individual community members. And the first thing I always advocate is check your own baggage. Figure out how you feel about things and question, why do I feel that way? Because what I have found is that if you have baggage about a particular issue, you'll have baggage about multiple issues that have some tenuous connection. And if you really want to affect change and further Columbus's push towards the future and our diverse inclusion, figure out your own behavior and then interrupt bad behavior when you see it. It could be in the form of a comment or a tasteless humor or joke. If uninterrupted, you're giving permission for that person to continue that. You don't have to get in people's face. You can just gently say, yeah, that's not going to work. I don't appreciate that. You can do it nicely. When we interrupt behaviors, we can have a lifelong impact. And it starts really small, and it's very, very easy once you get the hang of it.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes to wrap up. Please, Orville.
All right, quick 5 points. It should take about 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Oh, make them good.
First of all, just really speak kindly of other ethnic groups. We often speak so negatively about people because we don't know them, we weren't raised like them. We need to stop that, because obviously once you start, as Gloria said, once you start speaking negatively about someone, then it kind of permeates the rest of how we interact with them. So we have to be very careful with that. Second is, just commit to allowing other ethnicities to have unfettered access to arts and sciences. Mm-hmm. Clearly, education is one of the things that helps break the poverty cycle, generational poverty, and to also allow them opportunities and equal opportunities, equal access to education and employment. 3, when you have an opportunity, vote for issues that benefit the homeless, mentally ill, disabled, and other groups that may not be like you, because we all, I appreciate what you said, we all have an opportunity to become disabled. It doesn't make, it's not income and it's not color of your skin. So I appreciate that. 4, and this is really is important, when I moved to Old Town East, the neighborhood became gentrified, but one of the things that went away was our kids playing in the street. The cops got called and the kids quit playing in the street, and then we went someplace else to where they got involved in gangs. Allow the kids to be kids. I mean, and that's very important if we are going to move forward. Just let kids be young. And lastly, volunteer your time to do something that, that involves others. That's it.
Thank you. Lily, will you close us out, please?
Sure. And I really want to reinforce one of the things that Orville said there, and that is that for many of us new Americans, you represent us. Please vote, and please consider all these important issues that affect not only the quality of our lives as new Americans, as immigrants, but also is going to impact you, either directly or indirectly. And for many people from other countries who do not understand the democratic process, they may not really feel comfortable trying to vote, but you do. You understand it. So do it for you and do it for us as well. The other thing that is very important is become engaged. Reach out to these new Americans, to the Latinos, to the Somalis, to the Asians, to whoever lives in your neighborhood, and try to get to know them a little bit better, because they're eager to make friends. And also, I think it's very important to realize that it's not that we don't want to learn English, is that many times we're afraid to do it because we're not going to do it well. And so maybe you reaching out with a friendly attitude towards us is going to help more people want to communicate and talk to you and share a little bit more about who they are and what brought them here. Because they are here, as I said earlier, to make this place home and to give it the very best they have. And I want to leave you with a picture of the future that we need to start considering today. New Americans are the fastest growing communities in our state. The Columbus City has the largest number of Latinos in an urban setting than anywhere else in the state. Within 5 or 10 years, the leaders that you now have will be moving on, and there will be new people taking those places. It is our responsibility to mentor and to help these people understand how we function and what kind of life we want in the future of our communities, because they're the ones that are going to be in the lead. So I think that together we can do a lot more than what we can do apart. And remember that there's a lot more that brings us together and that we have in common than what tears us apart. So let's just be united and move forward with that goal of making this a better place for everyone.
Thank you, Lily. And I'd like everyone to please give a round of applause to our panelists today. And I'd like to remind our viewing audience that the Community Relations Commission's role, one of our roles, is to enforce protected classes. And that also our leader, Mayor Michael B. Coleman, created the New Americans Initiative in 2005 to ensure that all immigrant refugee communities had access to our city, state, county agencies. And also, I'd like to close by saying from Lucas and Sarah Sullivan to today's leaders, starting with Mayor Coleman, Columbus is a city that welcomes diverse communities. Are we perfect? Not yet, but we are slowly and surely getting there. It takes time to achieve progress, and our panelists have certainly shared with us how much time that takes, but we have arrived, and it takes the community. It takes each of us getting to know each other and each other's neighborhoods, and it also takes each of us reaching out to one another and educating ourselves. As we celebrate our bicentennial, we are reminded of the progress that this city has achieved and the role models, some of whom have been mentioned today, and the institutions that have helped to make our city the great city that it is, a perfect place for us to live, work, and raise our families. And with that, I'd like to remind anyone, again, if you would like to contact the Community Relations Commission, our office is 645-1993. And also, we welcome people to be part of this education committee. And if you would like more information, we have a sign-in sheet at the back. But also for our viewing audience, if you could contact Gail Gray at 645-1950. Thank you all for being here, and thank our viewing audience for watching this program today.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was great.